pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Brent Ahrens, class of 85 and 86 in mechanical engineering. What I'd like to do today, if I could, is to kind of put some of the research into some context. As my father-in-law, who used to teach speech a lot, basically said, don't tell them a lot of time telling them what you're going to tell them, just tell them. So, but I wanted to do this quickly enough so you guys have a sense for the sort of things that we'll go through here. So a little bit of my bio background that I'll blow through that since Mickey did most of that already. A teeny bit about what is venture capital. I suspect people know a little bit about it, but I'll do sort of the quick primer on that and about my firm. I have to do a promotional pitch, and you'll see the tagline and the firm name everywhere here. I thought about this in the context of, so here's interesting research, what does that mean? And in some respects, how does it manifest itself in my world on a daily, weekly, yearly basis? Getting out of our comfort zones and things like that, and then wrap it up. So my story that Mickey already went into a little bit, I was born in Port Clinton, Ohio at the ripe old age of 18. Couldn't wait to get out of home. I suspect like a lot of people, came here and spent a number of years living in Dayton, moved to Cincinnati, worked there for a few years, rented a U-Haul, moved up to Hanover, New Hampshire, and then decided that go west, young man. There's a lot of interesting stuff in California, and have been out there for 15 plus years. You guys heard all this stuff already in terms of my background. As I was thinking about things last night, just the impact that this school has had on me is it's not lost as I just think about things, those moments of quiet reflection, or just in my daily work and the sorts of things that I think about and do. Just wanted to thank some of these guys up here and not pandering to the crowd, because I don't know if any of these guys are going to be here today. And if Tony's here, you can tell Joe I gave him a little pat on the back. And hopefully I can see him later today. But some really influential people, and it's good to see some of them are still around and their bios are on the website. But some great people here, and for me it's been a great grounding in my life and in my career. So let me tell you a little bit about venture capital. Who knows something about venture capital? Okay, a little bit. So venture capital in the world capital markets, think of if people have an IRA or 401k or any sort of retirement plans or those sorts of things, there's just a ton of money that's available in the world markets that some of it comes to University of Dayton, people own stock in companies like Johnson & Johnson, et cetera. Venture capital, we're a teeny little cottage industry that's all of, $20 to $30 billion, and we invest in startup companies. Startups meaning somebody's got a cool idea, it could be incredibly high growth, but it could hit the wall tomorrow and you lose all your money. And so we're kind of, some would say lender of last resort, but there's a technical distinction. We don't lend money. I give somebody some money and I get a chunk of your company. So let me just sort of walk through a little bit about sort of what this means, somewhat structurally, and I can give some examples, and maybe at the end I can go into more Q&A here. So my job is to essentially think of me like a Coke distributor. So you've got Coca-Cola sitting in Atlanta, and you've got millions of places, the local 7-Eleven, McDonald's, et cetera, that want to sell Coca-Cola, right? How does that stuff get from this corporation that has this product and this brand out to the world, where you've got a bunch of distributors along the way, right? People, we see the Coke trucks, the beer trucks out there. Essentially, I'm a distributor for money. It's kind of an odd thing, but my product is money as opposed to Coke or beer or something like that. Where does my money come from? A teeny portion of it is mine. We have to put some in by law. Most of it comes from this group of characters called limited partners. Limited partners may literally be the University of Dayton endowment, and that could be the endowment that helps to put up the next building. It could be the pension plan that exists. I assume that there's some sort of pension or retirement for employees once you're here long enough. That's largely the source of money that comes into the venture business. Public pension plans, foundations, endowments, sometimes wealthy individuals, insurance companies put a lot of money into the venture business. So that's where the money goes. We go out and we beg for capital every few years, and we raise what's called a fund. Think of a mutual fund. You have a bunch of stuff in there, right? So we have a pool of capital. We take that money, we look at a bunch of startup companies and say, hey, this one's pretty cool. Let's invest in this company. With the idea being that I give them some cash, they give me a stock certificate. My kids, by the way, think this is crazy. My oldest is 12, my next is 11, and they say, wait, you give people millions of dollars, they give you a piece of paper? Dad, you're not very smart. You're coming out on the short end of the stick here. I said, yeah, but that piece of paper hopefully is worth 5, 10, 50 times what I paid for it. Oh, well, that could be kind of cool. So we give money to these little companies, and we try to help as best we can, typically serving on the board of the company. And I own, as a firm, 10, 15, 20, 50% of this company. And you hope at some point in time that you have what some would think of as sort of nirvana. There's an IPO, initial public offering. It's a little private company. Initial public offering goes to being a public company. And think of all the companies that you've heard of, whether it's Facebook recently, LinkedIn, Zynga, Groupon. All those were venture-backed companies, and now they're public companies. And investors, quite honestly, have done really well. Even if those stocks have been a bit challenged, they've done pretty well. Or M&A is merger and acquisition. Typically, this is actually statistically speaking, the route that happens more frequently. Some big company comes in, a Johnson & Johnson says, I'll buy your company, or somebody like that, and away you go. What I didn't list here, because this doesn't result in money going back to these guys, is a fair number of these things actually just hit the wall. You put in some money, sorry, gave it the old college try, and you wind up with a zero or something less than your money back, but that's life. So that's a little bit about the venture business. Our firm has been around since 1987. We're currently managing a fund of $600 million that will invest in approximately 45 to 50 companies over the next few years or so. And with the idea being, again, we'll put the money to these companies. Hopefully a lot of money comes back to our investors, and then we'll get a piece of that. That's sort of the profit motive that we have in this thing. So let me move beyond that, but gives you a little bit of a context, I hope, for what the venture business is about. So now let me just sort of like a sub-agenda, if you will, how I'm going to talk through things. So sort of 3 sections to the rest of the presentation. This, to me, is sort of the meat of things in terms of the importance of what you all do as researchers and scholars. And I try to give some examples that hopefully resonate with folks in sort of 3 different areas, if you will. By the way, my expertise and specialty is in healthcare, so I've got a bias here. So I've got a little bit more richness that I can speak to here. But I think these kinds of things play out everywhere, quite honestly. Just some advice on just how, as I was thinking about things that I read over the past few years and what people have gone through, and just ways to at least have a headset on this. And then how do we break out of our comfort zones? So let's start with a healthcare example. I'll give you a second here to look at the little cartoon. A little geeky, all right? So, and I started with sort of already a case example in mind, and as I was doing some research, I found this interesting thing on for a publication from the Texas Heart Institute. I tried to footnote as best I could. We had a lunchtime conversation about plagiarism, but I liberated freely from the web. It's free, right? So some of the greatest developments in cardiology, the study of the heart in the 20th century. A whole bunch of interesting things here. I won't go through all these things. But I'm going to focus on these things that are kind of highlighted, shaded out a little bit in yellow, and what these things mean. So cardiac catheterization. Catheter is basically sort of think of a long stick, and can you get something into the heart to do interesting things there, whether it's for imaging purposes or therapeutically, can you do something? Open heart surgery, I suspect everybody knows what that is. More specifically, something called CABG, coronary artery bypass grafting. And then the last thing, coronary angioplasty, and that refers to the coronary vessels, the heart vessels, sometimes have a blockage, and you can do certain things. You can try to open them back up again and related technologies. So let me focus on these 3 things. So if we start with sort of the market need, this is in the context of what we do in the venture business. Sort of simplistically, people often say, well, do you start with, is it a technology looking for a home and you've got something that you can pursue there? Or do you start with a market need? Generally speaking, a heck of a lot better to start with a market need and then say, well, what's a possible solution? I heard a lot of that this morning in terms of, well, here's something that we could do. So when one has a blockage in a heart artery, a coronary artery, this can result in a myocardial infarction, basically loss of blood flow or much less blood flow to a particular region of the heart. Oh my gosh, I feel some pain here. This is one of the main reasons why. So you get some blockage, and it's a problem, right? Lots of people die every year from so-called heart attacks. So over the past several decades, there have been three very influential people, obviously many, many people who've affected this over the course of time. And I'll sort of get to the thread of what these guys did in a second here, but Dr. Robert Getz was a cardiac and thoracic surgeon, I believe in Metro New York. And Dr. Getz took a big leap almost 55, 60 years ago by now, and did one of these CABG procedures. I've got an idea. Let me do something to get around that blockage. And that's what a CABG procedure does. The amount of research, sort of tying it back to the theme of today, that went into doing that, and imagine if you were that first patient. Yeah, sure, Dr. Getz, sign me up for that. Let me understand, what are you going to do? Well, we're going to take a saw, and we're going to cut your chest, right through the sternum. Okay, then what? Well, then we're going to take this rib, the spreader, and fillet you open like that. Okay, you got me going so far. This is pretty cool, right? And then what happens? Well, then there's this little sac around your heart. We're going to cut through that. Well, that doesn't seem so bad. And then what? Well, we may have to actually cut into your heart muscle. Wait a minute. How's the blood going to start flowing through the rest of my body? Isn't that lethal? Well, we got this thing called a heart-lung machine. You going to trust me on that technology? I did some research over the past couple of days on that piece alone. Heart-lung machine basically takes over for your heart and your lungs when you're having these kinds of procedures. It took 23 years of a guy doing research and working collaboratively with IBM and the federal government, a whole bunch of places, to get to the point of having the first heart-lung machine. You know, imagine that person too. Trust me, we'll stop your heart, we'll breathe for you. Oh, okay, fine. Well, so imagine those early patients and the research that happened over decades. And now, if you look at the literature in these areas, there are probably literally millions of articles that touch on what these gentlemen have done. So Getz was the first guy who basically said, I got an idea, let's do this CABG procedure, let's get by the blockage. Fast forward probably 20 years or so, and a guy sitting in Germany and Switzerland, Andreas Grunzig, said, we did this thing called catheterization. We put a stick in somebody's heart. That's cool, we got there. And generally they make an incision in the leg and they go up and snake it around. Maybe we can do something. Once we're there, why not try something? So he came up with this idea of, let's put a balloon on a stick. That's really cool. Wow, it's just crazy, right? So imagine the first patient there too. And then Dr. Palmaz and a partner named Schatz later on had this idea, well, we've already done this stuff. This is old hat by now. And this guy came up with something cool. Once we're in there, let's do something else. Let's put something called a stent. It's a little metal tube, screen-like structure. Let's put that in there to permanently keep this vessel open. Yeah, that's a great idea. So imagine all these sort of firsts that happen and all the stuff that goes into the background. I think you're head of the IRB, is that right? Imagine the IRBs, institutional review boards that exist within the institutions to say, yeah, go ahead. How many of these been done in the world? There's always the idea of sort of a reference site. Has Stanford done one of these? No. Has Miami Valley done? No. Children taught? No. We're number one. Okay, let me think about that, all right? So here's sort of an evolutionary tree, and these to me are absolutely fascinating vignettes of what happens time and time and time again. Certainly where I spend my time, and I'll get to this in a second, but I just sort of see this happening throughout in lots of different industries. Imagine, if you will, so the simple example would be a car. Henry Ford made it very popular. Lots of people sort of had a hand in getting cars sort of to the marketplace. And a car was kind of four wheels, and it got you faster there than walking or a bicycle or a horse, right, ultimately? Well, that wasn't good enough, so we added things like doors. Well, that wasn't good enough. We added windshields. And then those windshields became a plastic glass sandwich of sorts. And then we added radios. And then we added air conditioning and blah, blah. I bought a new minivan because I got a bunch of kids a year and a half or so ago. It's got this really cool little camera in the back, right? So when I back up, I can see what's behind me. I didn't know I needed that. Now I couldn't live without it. So the sort of the proliferation and sort of filling the spaces between when you start with some basic thing and how it just seems like there's this inexorable march to add new technologies into our world. I mean, look at the stuff that exists in this room alone. How many new technologies are here? So it's pretty cool stuff. So let me start back to, you've got a blockage in a vessel on your heart. Grunzig said, well, let's do a bypass. And so what happens here is you can take a vessel from somewhere else in the body. Frequently, it's a big vein from the legs. You take a vein, make it an artery. That's you're going to do what? Because they're sort of different tissues. You take a vein, you cut a piece of that, and you basically do what's called a jump. So you've got open vessel here, but it's blocked in between. Well, let's just do a jump across. Of course, you have to make a little incision, suture this thing on so that the blood now, instead of going like this, kind of goes around like this. That's the idea of a cabbage procedure. So that's what this guy came up with. Again, tons of research. Think about, you did this on animal studies, you do all kinds of things, you look at cadavers, is this feasible? What are the tools to do it? There's a whole bunch of tool sets, all that kind of stuff. That's pretty cool. Well, since then we figured out simple things like diet and exercise can make a huge difference in cardiovascular disease. As I have this is Diet Coke, but it's still probably not so good for me, right? This makes a big difference. And of course, there have been tons of medications. I don't know if anybody's ever taken a drug called Lipitor. It's called a statin that basically helps you to reduce the two types of cholesterol, LDL, HDL. It lowers the LDL levels. Pfizer, a large multinational based in New York, sells this drug. It just went off patent about a year ago. Peak sales, almost $14 billion a year, with profit of almost $14 billion a year. So it's a huge cash machine, was for Pfizer. So lots of solutions to treating this disease state. But let's focus on sort of the procedural aspects, doing surgery and intervening with patients along those lines. So he did this, 60 years ago or so. And it turns out I've got this actually wrong here. This was actually the heart-lung machine, which is, people often call it the piano because this is the size of an upright piano. These were actually invented before, which enabled him to do his thing. So this is chronologically a little bit off. But he also spawned a whole bunch of other things where this is a robot. There's a company called Intuitive Surgical that's based in the Bay Area that makes robots that can do these things really well. And the surgeons are literally sort of outside the room, got a headset on, and they're manipulating little things like this. It's really pretty cool. Tools, so if frequently people did these things on a heart-lung machine, I'm going to stop your heart. We're mission control. We're going to take over here. We're going to stop your lungs. We'll take over that too. Well, people say, well, wouldn't it be better if we could actually do this on a beating heart? And the evolution and God's input on what we're doing here is pretty darn good, right? We're pretty efficient machines. We work pretty well. Let's take advantage of that. The lungs work well. The heart works well. So people came up with some tools so you could do these things on a beating heart, but you've got to stabilize it. Imagine the heart's going like this. And you're going to try to put this teeny little suture, little thread, into the vessel when it's beating. Oh, by the way, every 3 to 4 seconds, the lungs are going, so you've got the heart going like this, superimposed with this thing going like this. It's pretty tricky, so you have to come up with ways to stabilize it. So there's a whole area of technology there. So this has spawned just an amazing amount of new technology, and ultimately some of these things are way, way better for patients as well. Instead of doing this big crack the chest, you can do it through smaller incisions, so a lot of advantages here. Grinsig, I'm sorry, this was Getz. Grinsig came along with this idea of let's put a balloon on a stick. And it was just sort of an aha moment for him, and he said, well, let's actually do this. This is an angioplasty catheter. So you go into this blocked area with this thing. When you get to your point of interest, you squeeze the bulb, basically, and this little balloon goes boop, and it pushes this plaque out of the way. That's pretty cool. The plaque is still there, but now you've kind of pushed out of the way, and the blood vessels are pretty elastic. They're muscular, so it'll give a little bit. That worked well for a pretty long time. But after all, people said, wait a minute, you get some collapse later on. You haven't taken the stuff out, and there's often, it's called it's a rebound. I did this, it's going to come back. It's almost sort of a law of physics. So Paul Maas came up with this idea, well, let's put a scaffold in there. It's called a stent. Well, that's pretty cool. And this stent is called a bare metal stent. It's just a piece of stainless steel, a material called nitinol. It wasn't good enough because you could put the stent in place, holds the vessel open, but that begets other problems. I think somebody talked about that this morning where, one problem begets another, one solution begets another problem. So we're kind of chasing the pea around the plate a little bit. So this bare metal stent begets something called a drug-eluting stent. So here's this tube of metal, and people decided, let's coat this with a drug. Okay, and those drugs will not let the cells proliferate, will keep the tissues at bay for a while. That drug will slowly wear off. Good to go. But it turns out when you do drug-eluting stents, patients have clotting issues. Well, last thing you want to do is have a blood clot because I just sort of fixed a blockage problem and I'm going to induce another one? That's kind of crazy. So those patients on drug-eluting stents have to take a pill to prevent the clotting. So you can see how this one little idea, things just kind of kept branching out, and ends up being rather large. Another branch of the stent tree, these are stents that are used elsewhere in arteries and veins. This is one that's used coming out of the heart. You've got the aorta, and then it branches off to the legs. You kind of see that would be something that would fit there and other places in the body. So this is an absolutely sort of amazing story over, certainly going back to the heart-lung machines and other things like that, decades and decades of research and investment and development and technologies. And today, this entire business, we spend in the US alone, I think it's about $150 billion on cardiac care, just that alone. And there are lots of disease states within that, but this is a huge business. That's going to double in the next, some would say 10 years, certainly the next 15 years. So whole different discussion around the woes of our healthcare system, but big dollars being spent here. So again, a lot of this comes down to the basic research that people like you all do. Really important stuff. Putting this in a different perspective here, I was thinking about, so one of the ways that we often think about from an investing perspective, what are some of the trade-offs here? And one of the things you look at is what's the relative cost of some of these things? Eating healthy, exercising is relatively low cost, right? But you start taking some pills, and it doesn't, the invasiveness to your body is not that big of a deal. Start taking some pills, a little bit more invasive, and so as you go up this chain here, this is pretty severe stuff, and in some respects, the lesson to all of us is if we can kind of keep things simple, we're going to be better off at the end of the day, but that's not always possible. Hope this is clear enough, but one of the things I was pondering was the great, so what? Who cares? So we spent tons of money and years developing these things. Has this had any impact on things? This is a mortality chart on a normalized basis, so it's a percentage basis from 1935 to 2010, and looking at death from all different causes here. And the focus here is on heart disease, which is this lowermost portion of the curve. And you can see on a normalized basis how it's going up as we have better and better diets, shall I say, more good stuff to eat. We see it going up like this, and guess what starts happening here? We're flattening off here, and against the backdrop of the population's obviously increasing, right, pretty dramatically over the past several decades, but you see it tailing off. And the reason why is in no small part because of the advances in technology. It's having dramatic impact. Interesting, if you look at the next one up, I believe this is cancer. Cancer is more a disease of aging. Back here, the average lifespan was a couple of decades less than it is today. No surprise, a disease of aging, you're going to see a greater portion of people die from cancer, and that's unlikely to change over the course of time. Some interesting other blips along the way, but key thing being with respect to heart disease, we've had a dramatic impact, and the federal government recognizes this, and the government is spending a ton of money, for example, right here in cancer care today. If we sort of zoom in on that chart and just look at deaths due to cardiovascular disease from 1900 to 2004, this is absolute, so this isn't relative. This is pretty fascinating. So you see, it's probably tougher to capture data back here, admittedly. But as we had the so-called Western diet, more fat in our diet, those kinds of things, you're going to see absolute deaths increasing. But look, beginning in 1960, flattening off, and a non-trivial drop-off. And again, if you look at the population change, and this has continued to go down a little bit too, over the past several decades, the population here has gone up, yet we've curtailed the number of deaths. So this tells me that there's some, if part of what I look at is return on investment, as a society, there's a huge ROI for this thing. Everybody has the productive lives and what they can bring to society. This is big stuff. If we look at this now over a closer in time frame from late 70s, same endpoint here, split males and females. Guess what? We have more work to do here. There's been much more focus on males for a whole bunch of reasons than there has on females, but now there has been in the past decade a lot more focus on, well, wait a minute, why aren't we capturing females in the mix here? So we've got catheterizations, we talked about that, the bypass, how do you jump past the blockage? Carotid endarterectomy is basically the veins going up, or the arteries going up to your brain, cleaning those things out with a couple of different approaches. Open heart surgery. This is percutaneous coronary interventions, basically putting the stents in, going in with the catheter, blowing it up, putting a stent in place, and you're good to go. So you can see, look at if you sum these things up and say how many were being done of each of these things, bypass the thing that the guy started decades ago, kind of went up, tapered off a little bit. It's actually kind of flattened, and it's actually come up a little bit here. People said, you face a fundamental choice, ma'am or sir. We can submit you to surgery, crack your chest, and do all that kind of stuff. Or door number 2, let's put a catheter in, take a balloon, pump up the vessel, put a stent in place. Who's for door number 2? If possible, I'll take that one any day, right? It's a relatively small incision. You're in the hospital a day or 2 at most versus I've got to convalesce for 6 weeks. I've got this huge incision in my leg. My chest hurts, all that kind of stuff. So that's had a dramatic impact as this new technology has come along. And look at the catheterizations, how that's gone up pretty dramatically. The PCI, the stents and the things that are doing the vessel expansion, weren't even on the page until 1990. And look at the growth. Pretty dramatic, isn't it? So these things are having huge, huge impact in our lives and society. Who uses anything other than Google today? Do you use Google at all? Okay. Google owns the market, right? Look where it was 10 years ago. I was a Yahoo user, had used Netscape a little bit, and it's just de facto, they're sort of the standard, right? Look how this changed. So from 2002, Google at 30% of all search queries, basically. And look how this changed in 2 years from that time period. The company went from nowhere to being something that's worth, I think it's the term market capitalization, it's worth about $200 billion. And those two guys, the founders, I think are worth $20 billion apiece or something like that. Pretty amazing. Now let me shift gears to talk about this a little bit on, I call it the softer side of life, but all the social, humanitarian. It's easy for me to gravitate to the sort of the hard sciences with degrees in engineering. I spend my life looking at healthcare, data. This is the stuff that really, I think, makes life interesting. USA Today yesterday, obesity on the rise, national average, 2010, 36%, 2030, 50%. This speaks to this exactly. There is always some, sort of quantification in the background for some of these things, but to me, this is pretty rich stuff. Interesting guy. I don't know if anybody has met this guy. I've never met him before, but he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006, basically for microfinance. And it was just sort of reading some of the history of what he went through. And now microfinance in India and other developing countries is enormous. We actually have an investment in a microfinance company. Really pretty cool stuff. Interesting statistic from one source about how he did personally with his first loans. He didn't lose money, but did make a ton, but he wasn't in it to make money necessarily. And as I was thinking about just who are people that you don't think of in the sciences or sort of the harder sorts of things who have had an impact, I don't think there's a tech person in the bunch, is there? It's just sort of, gosh, these are people who've had dramatic impact in our lives in a whole bunch of different ways. And the list goes on, of course. This was actually the reference biography online. Pretty interesting, and this is the kind of stuff that, in some levels, this is the looking into your heart of hearts and sometimes those dark places. These guys kind of help and have helped over time to elucidate some of those things and can kind of drive societies forward in a pretty big way. Just to kind of get to the point of having a little bit of how do we all continue to do what we do, yet take some risks and step outside of our comfort zone? And for these first couple of guys, turns out the three examples here are all Israelis. It was just sort of coincidental more than anything, but maybe there's a story there too. Anybody know who this guy is or hear of him? So, impressive background. The Technion is a really good school in Israel. Kind of did a traditional, let me just sort of walk my way up through the ranks here, spent some time at Wright Pat, various other places. Oh yeah, by the way, the guy got a Nobel Prize in chemistry for quasi-crystals. People said these things can't exist. Take a second to read this. I find it absolutely fascinating, right? This guy's he's doing his thing. I got my head down, I come up with something, maybe it's a fluke. you apply the scientific method. Let me do this again. I think he was taking, was it aluminum and gold, and he had melted both of them, kind of just slammed them together basically to see what would happen, and he came up with these things, and everybody's like, no, that can't be. And he did it again, and he did it again, and again. Wow, there's something to this. So here are some of Sheckman's thoughts on this. I was thrown out of my research group. I brought shame on them with what we were saying. And this is great. I never took it personally. I knew I was right and they were wrong. Talk about courage of your convictions, right? That's something that you guys have to have that. As you're sitting there doing research every day, because I did a little bit of research in past lives, it can get a little bit dry. It's kind of, sometimes you're isolated. You've got to have that, right? Discovery fundamentally altered how chemists conceive of solid matter. Wow, that's pretty cool stuff. And here's sort of Sheckman's advice. Good scientist is humble, listening. Textbooks are right, maybe, most of the time, right? Hershko won the Nobel Prize in Biochemistry 2004. Ubiquitin-mediated protein degradation, that's a mouthful. Turns out his research has led to a blockbuster cancer drug called Velcade that's doing extremely well and saving lots of lives. Here's his background. His family was from Hungary, and they were Jewish, and the Nazis decided, we don't want these guys around here, and they separated them. Luckily, the family got back together after the war. The story is his father showed up one day, a couple of years afterwards, knocking on the window like at their home, and they were scared because it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and oh my God, Dad's here, right? And this guy's kind of, my Nobel Prize, whatever, he's delighted that he gets to take his grandchildren to school in the morning, right? How's that for perspective? That's pretty cool. This is pretty cool. Can I do something? Why don't you study the opposite? Oh, okay. That's interesting. I ran to the library. Look at that. Hundreds of papers on protein formation, almost none on protein degradation. Oh, okay. Well, here's the Venn diagram. Why don't I look outside the diagram, because there's probably a bigger world out there. Just an interesting perspective on how do you kind of keep things fresh, because, again, it can be a little bit tiresome in my experience. Maybe you guys disagree because you're doing research all the time and it's your life and your passion, but it's just interesting how he did this. And look at this, make the world better. That's a grand idea. What he tells his students: don't ignore the unexpected findings, serendipity. Your mentor is not good, leave him. Tries to pass on to his students. So let me. This is hopefully a quick story. So this is a guy who did his PhD at, I think he did it at Berkeley, and then he went to Stanford or vice versa. And we have an office in Israel, so I was visiting there a couple of years ago, and a friend of a friend introduced me to this guy, and I was at Weitzman, which is just an amazing place. And they said, oh, you should go meet Noam. All right, fine. So I go around and down the tunnel and into this building, and this guy's got this little lab that somebody had sponsored. And nice to meet you. I lived in the Bay Area, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, I'm just curious, what are you researching? And he said, smell. I said, what about smell? He said, everything. That's kind of big, isn't it? And he goes, yeah, but it's pretty cool. Oh, that's kind of cool. So if you go to his webpage, our lab study is olfaction in human subjects and machines. That sounds nice, but it's smell. And I said, well, tell me, Noam, a little bit more about this. And he said, think about light. So what color is this pointer? Red, right? What color is his shirt? Blue. Assuming people aren't colorblind, this is a black speaker. He said, if I tell you the color, you can tell me the wavelength, and vice versa, right? If I tell you something smells sweet, it's hard for you to tell me the structure. If I give you the structure, you can't necessarily tell me it's sweet or sour or whatever. I'm trying to figure that stuff out. And he said, oh, by the way, the interplay between smell and taste and things like that is a whole rich thing unto itself. So this guy's going to spend the next 30, 40 years of his life at Weitzman cracking the code on some of these things. And he's done some fascinating research already. He was looking at sleep apnea. You wake up during the night and you never get good sleep. And he found that he had a nasal tube with the subject in his lab, and he was running various smells by them. This smells like cotton candy. This smells like a vanilla bean. This smells like this. And it turned out it had a huge impact on reducing sleep apnea in these patients. He's trying to figure out why. And he's understanding, what about the receptors in the nose that actually pick up these things, where the chemical that is the smell binds and does something, and how does that work in the brain? Really cool stuff. So it's just kind of provocative as I think about this guy's doing some big stuff. I was delighted to hear this morning, because I have this sense, and wrongly so, this is why I wanted to change my slides, but I'll just speak to it anyway, that people tend to work sort of in their own silos. And I heard the word collaboration and interdisciplinary about 50 times this morning. I was saying over lunch. I think that's awesome. Probably realistically, that doesn't happen all that much, is my sense, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong here, but as I read through paper after paper in the scientific journals that we get at the office, people tend to sort of do stuff in their own little world. But there seems like on the margins a lot more interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary talk happening. So, the somewhat flippant question I was going to have for everybody is, when was the last time, the guys in the business school went over to the engineering school and went over the school of education, those kinds of things? And I heard it this morning, and I suspect, let's be realistic here, it's not going to happen everywhere and every day, and it's not necessary and appropriate in all cases. But nonetheless, it is pretty cool to be able to go out and do that. And what are you thinking about? What are you seeing? So we'll leave it as a rhetorical question. When does that happen? Was Rebecca, was she the English professor this morning? Anybody remember this Apple campaign? My last job, Apple is in Cupertino, which is kind of the next city over from where we live. And I used to work in Cupertino, and so I'd drive by Apple headquarters every day on my way to work. This was like 15 years ago. And our office manager, Peggy, they put up this massive banner, it's probably bigger than this wall, on the front of Apple headquarters. It's right next to a big highway. It just drives me crazy. I'm like, what? She said, Apple's thing, think different, should be differently. Okay, fine. But really? It's one of those like, oh, okay. So I did some, of course, like everything else, you look online, right? Since I'm far from being a linguist or somebody who understands English grammar all that well. And there were interpretations. You could sort of take it either way. I'd be curious to hear Rebecca opining on this. But just think, it's just sort of that's a little provocative. And Apple is known to be not gun-shy about doing some things in any case. But this really got people talking. And here's this local conversation, and it happened everywhere in the Silicon Valley. So I guess this is in the category of advice or what have you, just things that I was thinking about over the past little while. And in some respects, this is the stuff that I see in all of our companies, and how do little startup companies that are starved for cash kind of make stuff work, because it's not easy, right? First of all, keep doing what you're doing. You guys do some fantastic stuff. It was awesome sitting in this morning, and I'm disappointed I missed a couple of the sessions, but really cool stuff. It's really fun. I assume most of you have kids. I've got ages 3 to 11 or 12. Forget now. Got so many of them. The curiosity and the playfulness that kids have, I think that kind of gets bred out of us, so to speak, as we go through elementary school, and you got to stay in the lines and that kind of thing. Yeah, okay. But at the same time, don't lose some of that. And for me, it's just kind of fun, I get home at the end of the day, and my 3-year-old, Daddy, let's wrestle. And you kind of throw things out the window. But that sort of curiosity, what makes things tick, if you can keep some of that somehow, I think we're all better off for it. The stuff you guys do is important. And again, thinking of my days in research, albeit a long time ago, part of why I didn't like research is because I didn't have a sense as to, well, how did this fit in the grander scheme of things, whether it's the next level up or 10 levels up? That drove me crazy. So I had to kind of get away from that. But what you do does matter. And whether it's this proliferation of cardiac care or the automobile, example after example, this is good stuff. Speaking to everybody, but I was thinking about this in the context of the social sciences, humanitarian guys. I say this all tongue-in-cheek, but I have a lot of respect for everybody. Furthering our knowledge about life is core to life. That's part of, everybody's on their own journey and search here. This is pretty cool stuff. I look at everything through the lens of, can I make money here? I invest 10 million, can I get 50 million out? That's not the end-all, be-all, I get that. So I try to focus on what are these things that just sort of are there time after time after time, because this idea of pattern recognition that I suspect everybody has to greater or lesser degrees. If you're doing research and seeing things, oh, this fits here. I do the same thing that happens to be investing in a business. So I think there's some things that transcend. The last thing I think about, I've said this a few times here, and the Spanish expression, con mucho gusto, comes to mind. Go at it. Have fun, right? Life's too short, and if you don't like what you're doing, find something that floats your boat. So this is my daughter, Elizabeth. She's now 8.5 years old, almost 9. And she's probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 here. Lizzie, of course, Lizzie doesn't look like me. We were lucky enough to have been guided to Elizabeth. We adopted her from South Korea. And Lizzie was 2.5, maybe 3 years old. And she got hot pink cowboy boots for Christmas. And these are just the coolest little things. You go to Target, $15, and she loved wearing these things around. We just moved into a new house, and my son Thomas had gotten a bike for his birthday or something like that. And Thomas said, "Daddy, let's go to the track. And I want you to time me. Get your watch and okay, let's go." And Lizzie said, "I go too." All right, come on. So I put her in the running stroller or something like that. And my wife said on the way out, "Oh, don't forget her tennis shoes because she's got her cowboy boots on." Okay, that's a good idea. So I take the kids over to the school, and Thomas is like, "Ready, Daddy?" I'm like, "Okay, go Thomas, go." And he's pedal like crazy on his bike, and he comes around the track, and how'd I do? Minute and a half or whatever. And Lizzie said, "Daddy, I go too." I said, "Oh, sweetie, you're a little too small to ride on Thomas's bike." "No, I run." I'm thinking like, okay, sure, what's she gonna run from here to the wall or something like that? And I forgot the tennies were in the bottom of the stroller, and she just took off. And here's this little pixie. She's got a little bob in her hair, and she ran around the track and did a lap, quarter-mile track, effortless. Just her hair's flowing, just like this, as if she was born to run. And I thought, my first thing was, oh crap, I left the pink cowboy boots on, and she's going to be hurting tomorrow, and Mommy's going to say, "You did what?" Right? And then she said, "Can I do it again?" Thinking to myself, oh, okay, why not, right? But wait, let me put on your tennis shoes first, right? So I changed her tennies, and then the aha moment happened, and I thought, oh my God, what do I have here? And I'll submit to everybody, we don't have to admit to this openly, I'll submit to everybody that we all stereotype. That could be a protective mechanism. I know that you're going to stop at the stop sign. I know it's a green light, you're going to go, that kind of thing, right? But how many times have we said, oh, my wife's family's Norwegian, oh, that's clearly a Norwegian trait. We all do that stuff, right? And all is not an overstatement. I'm convinced of that. Lizzie, there's no, other than the fact that we're in the same species, there's no genetic connection between my daughter and I. And suddenly this light bulb went on of like, hey buddy, you need to think long and hard about, there's this bucketing of stereotyping. To this day, I mean, it comes up almost on a daily basis. I think about Lizzie running around this track, saying, oh, what am I doing? Maybe I've got, the next Olympic star in my hands. Every parent thinks those kinds of things. But the point is that I was taken aback and had to just sort of think about, wow, it was a profound moment for me that clearly still has an effect on me. So maybe you guys can keep this as a visual as you go forward and do your research. And how do you kind of get jogged out of, we kind of go about life and kind of get into ruts sometimes. Occasionally something can get us out of that rut and get us to a place like, wow, that's an interesting perspective. So